the previous class, we have looked at how exactly we need to build our first component. What are the things that we need to keep in mind so that we can expose this component, and also defined where can this component be used. If you remember, .js-meta.xml file decides whether this component would be visible for the developers to add that onto the record page or not. And also we have defined the target for our component to be available for only the record page. And we have also created a card in which we have added the first message or the first text information that we had in a card, so that way we have beautifully presented that on the screen. Now at this point of time, this component is static. I do not have any interaction that the user can do on this page or on this component. Now what I wanted to do here is I want to add a button. That button goes here. Upon clicking on this button, I want to display some information somewhere here saying that button has been clicked. Now you might be wondering why exactly we are doing it. As of now, whatever that we update is mostly on the static side. That means the component that I've built is not changing if the user is interacting with it. So that is why I wanted to add some dynamism to this LWC component that we have built, so that way we can better use our LWC components when the actual requirements comes to us. In this section, we'll explore how to add a button to our LWC component, and also upon clicking on that button, how can we display a message. With that being said, let's go ahead and switch to our VS Code to start building this component. I switch to my LWC component. As I mentioned, I'm using the same component that I've built earlier to make some modifications. So this is my HTML file. What I need to do, I need to add a button. Now, do I know the syntax of this button? The answer is no. Again, take the help of your component library for getting those details. So I have again switched back to the browser where I'm looking for a button. So earlier we have looked at the components that are available to us and identified the card that we need to use. In case if you know the component, all you can do is simply search for that component here. Under the Lightning Web component, I have a button that I wanted to use. So I'll click on this one. Like discussed earlier, these are the options that we have. These are the preview of the code that Salesforce is giving us. So that way we can decide which code that we want to use for our button. So I want to go with this neutral button here, right? So this is what I wanted to make use of in my LWC component. Now, where do I get this code? I can get this code looking at this button code in this HTML. So what is the button type? The button type is neutral. So I look for anything that is set to neutral. If you see here, I was able to find out the neutral variant button. If I want the base one, I can look at this code and I can copy this code to get that look and feel for that button. If I want this brand button, I can copy this line of code. Since I have decided that I will be going ahead with this one, you can go ahead and use it. Or in case if you want to present two buttons where we click on a destructive button, which is in red, and another one is in success button. You can use those two buttons in case if you want to have a yes or no option. For time being, I'm just taking this neutral button that I've selected, so that way we can explore a few things and then come back making changes to our component. Now I've copied the code. Let's go back to our VS Code, paste it, and make some modifications so that the code would be working to our requirement. So this is the line of code that I've copied there. In case if you want everything, all the lines to be at once, you can also hide this section where you can just click on that folder explorer where it hides that section. Now all the lines of code is shown to me properly, so that way I can understand what is this line of code that I've copied. What is this button here? Now if you see here, this is the button tag, starting tag, and there's an end tag, which you already know. We would have a tags with a start tag and an end tag, which is good. And what are the attributes that we have? Usually the items that we write inside the tag are called attributes, right? So what are the attributes that we have here? One says label, another one says title. There is another attribute called onClick, and there is a class that is there. Now, if you see this class is basically giving us the look and feel. So this is mainly meant for helping your button look with the styling that we have seen there. It is okay if you ignore this class also, your functionality would be still working. So this is all the styling or the markup that we're giving to that button. For time being, I'll just keep this attribute aside and try to understand what are the other attributes that I have. Now, we have a label and we have a title. Let's go back to the button once from the component library to see which one has been displayed where. If you see here, this label, whatever that I write inside here has been displayed here on the button. So that means I need to make sure that this label is something that would be displayed to the end users. So let's go ahead and change that to the label that corresponds to our requirement. So since this button is mainly meant for display a message, so I'll say display message. I'm just naming this button as display message. All right, I know this button is too generic. For time being, I'm just naming this way. So that way we give the information to the user saying that upon clicking on it would display a message. If I save this code and deploy this one, let's see what would happen. So I'm selecting the component, click on deploy. The deployment is successful. Let's go to our Salesforce org to check that changes. Again, I'm doing a control R on my system. Feel free to do Command R if you are using Mac OS. Now, if you see here, we got a button. It says display message, whatever that we have written in our label. And upon hover, it is giving me the title, which is saying non-primary action, right? Which is good. I have not made changes on it. For time being, we can keep that point aside. Now, since it is a button, what is expected from the user? We are expecting the user to click on this button. Now, if I click on this button, nothing is happening. If you see, even though if I click multiple times here, there is nothing is happening here. Now, what is the expectation here? Upon clicking on this button, I wanted to display some message here under this. This is my first LWC component. How do I do that? Currently, there is no action that I've asked the system to look at when somebody is clicking on this button. So what is the event that has been firing? The event that is firing here is somebody is clicking on this button. So when somebody clicks on this button, I want some action to be performed. Now, where do I write it? How do I tell this button to look for that event? Or how do I tell the LWC component to act upon a click of a button? That is where, again, we need to go back to our VS Code, make some changes here. If you see here, this is the title that is showing up, which is good. For time being, we can ignore it. If you see here, there is a attribute that has been already given to us when we have copied that code. What it is saying, a pointing device button has been pressed and released on an element. So this action is triggered, the action triggered when the button is clicked. When this attribute would be firing an event when somebody clicks on that button. And what is the function that we are calling? If you see here, there is a function that we have used here. Now, what we need to do, we need to define what should system do or what should this LWC component should do when somebody clicks on this button. Now, ideally, if you ask me, this is not how you would write this one. Ideally, you would not start writing this one, right? Ideally, you would say, this is my button. Then you define, then you would go to your JS file. Again, why am I going to the JS file, not to this js-metadata.xml? This file basically tells me where is my LWC component being exposed to the developers, where it can be used. Now, that is not the place where I want to write my logic. I want to write my logic in this .js file. So that is where I have opened that file. Now, interestingly, what we would, if you are actually developing this component, what you would do, ideally you would define that function in this JS file, then go back to the HTML file and use that. All right, so this is how you would basically do it. Since we have copied this code from our component library, that is where we are seeing this coming up from there. So let's go back to that button once more to see what is there in the JS file. Right, in case if you are not sure on how can you get started with the JS file, use your component library for that idea, and then you can change that code according to your need. Now, if you see here, when somebody clicks on this button, on-click action would be triggered, on-click event would be triggered. And where is the logic to tell the LWC component that this is what you need to do when somebody clicks on the button? So if you see here, there is a handle click function that has been used. Where is this function defined, telling the LWC component this is what you need to do? If you go to the JS file, that is where you will be finding that function here. What I'll do, I'll copy this code. Going back to my LWC component, open the JS file. Because we have seen that in line number 3, it should be enclosed in line number 3. I'm just pasting it here. Now, what is happening? There is a line number 6 that I have copied, which I have no context to. What I'll do, I'll remove it. Now, for time being, what I did, I have created a function. It takes an input as event, and inside that function, I'm not doing anything at this point of time. Now, if I save the changes in the HTML, what would happen if somebody clicks on this button? What the controller would do? Controller would look for this function in my JS file. Do I have the function? I have the function. What am I doing inside it? I'm doing nothing inside it. For time being, just like how you write a system.debug, we can also do a debugging in your LWC component as well. How do you do it? By simply writing console.log. In case if you are familiar with the front-end part, you might have used this console log to printing the logs in the console tab to see how it works. Instead of going directly with the actual requirement, let's break it down into chunks. So that way we can understand how the control is moving from the HTML file to the JS file. And we can confirm that this function has been executed by printing the console log in the browser. So what I'll say, inside the handle click, and I'm just writing this console log to confirm that when somebody clicks on this button on the UI, this function gets called, and I should be seeing something in the console tab. In case if you do not know what exactly is a console tab in the browser, do not worry, we'll just see that in a second. Now what I'll do, I'll deploy this changes. A changes got deployed. Let's go back to our Salesforce org, do a hard refresh. Every time I'm doing a hard refresh, just to make sure that my latest changes are being reflected. I have the button, same button, no changes on this one. If I click on this, still nothing is happening. We have added a function, but still nothing is happening. How do I prove that the function that I've defined for this on-click event is firing or not? So if you remember, we have written a console log. So how do I access that logs? Do a right click and then say inspect. Once you do that, this section opens up. It could be opening on the right hand side, or it could be opening at the bottom just like me. Do not worry, irrespective of the place where this console tab is opening, you still can continue checking for the same thing that I'm checking at my end. We need to land onto the console tab, and if you see here, that is where I can see the logs that are getting printed. Now, if you want to get started, if you see here, I've clicked on this button for 5 times. That is why it is showing as 5. If I want to start off new, I can simply click on this clear icon that clears off all the logs, and I can start fresh. If I click on this button, if you see, I was able to print that console log that I have written in my function that is listening to the on-click event of that button. If I do it second time, this gets printed twice. If you see, 2 number gets added here. If I do it for the 3rd time, 4th time, this gets incremented. Right? So this is how you can ask the LWC component to perform certain actions when somebody is interacting with that button. So the interaction on this button is an on-click event. That is why we have written a function that process that on-click event. Now, is our requirement completed? Is our requirement completed? The answer is no. We are still waiting for a message to be displayed here. At this point of time, we were able to print something in the console, but not on the LWC component itself. How do we do that? Let's go back to our VS Code here and connect all the dots. So now what we know that if somebody clicks on this button, this function is getting invoked, and inside that function, this console log has been printed. Now, how do I pass some information to that HTML file if I have to put that in the pictorial format, which is basically used for the UI purpose, where we can interact with the user or display the information that we have to the user. And this is my JS file where I have a logic. So here I have a function, and here I have a lightning card in which I wanted to display a message. Now, what needs to happen when somebody clicks on that button that I have? The function has been called. So this has been processed. We know that by looking at this console log. Now, how do I pass on that information back to the HTML file? How do I pass on some message back to the UI? That is where we need to understand a concept called property. There should be a way for us to pass on that information from a JS file back to the HTML. For that, I'm using a property called message. Right? I'm just creating a variable. In simpler terms, you can think of this message as a variable in our Apex. All right. So I'm using this message as a variable in Apex. In case if you are familiar with the JavaScript concept, feel free to think that as a property. In case if you are coming from the OOPS background where you want to understand what exactly it is just a variable that I've declared here. Now, I've declared a variable. Did I set a value to it? I've set a blank value to it. Now, what is my intention? I wanted to pass on some information to this message. So what is that message that I wanted to set? I'll say this dot. I'll simply set message is equals this value. This message is coming from the JS file. I'm writing simply this text saying that this message is coming from the JS file. You can write anything. For time being, I'm just doing this one. Now, how do I tell that this message is what I'm referring here? So how do I tell the LWC component this message is nothing but the variable that I've declared here? Simply write this dot. To access that message, simply write this dot message and add your value. Right? So I'm just passing this value. You can pass anything. For time being, I'm just doing this one. What we did, we have set some message when somebody clicks on this button. Right? Initially, this value would be empty. When somebody clicks on this button, this function gets invoked and this message is been set with the latest value that we are passing here on line number 7. Now, if you see here, our message value has some content that it can pass on to the main file. So here we have set that value. Now, how do I pass this message to the HTML file? That is where I need to go back to the HTML file and provide some option for this component to show that information, right? So I have set something in the JS file. Did I put that in the HTML file which would be displayed to the end user? The answer is no. How do I do that? I can simply use, I can write the property, and in case if I want to display the content inside that property that has been set for this message, I need to enclose them in curly braces. So this is how you would ask the LWC component to display the content inside this message. I'm just adding a break tag here so that way it comes up in the next line. Right, so I've just added a break tag here. Break tag is like a new line where this content would be displayed in the next line rather than continuing in this line. Right, so I've made the changes. The point that we need to remember is we have created a variable, or we have created a property in JavaScript language, and we have set some value to this property when somebody clicks on this button. Which button? This button. And how am I displaying that information back to the UI? I'm putting the property in the curly braces so that way it can show that information that it has. Initially, it would be blank, and once somebody clicks on that button, it should be showing this information that I've set here. So that is the expectation. Once we deploy this component and test it, let's see by deploying these changes to our org. So the deployment is successful. Let's go back to our Salesforce org, refresh it. Now, if you see here, we still have that button and I do not have any message value being showing yet. Now pay attention to this section. Let's see what would happen if I click on this button. If I click on this button, there is a message that came up which says this message is coming from the JS file. In the console tab, I can see the console log information that I've used earlier, which says inside the handle click. That is how the users can interact with your component and you can do some actions accordingly. So the event that is firing here is on click event. That is where we have written a function listening to that event and we have printed some information once the button has been clicked. Now, the thing is, this button here doesn't seem good. If I go back to the lightning card that I was showing you earlier, this button was on the right hand side. I'm just searching for the lightning card and showing the output. So if you see here, this button is on the right hand side. For us, it is coming up here. Now, what do I need to do? Then what you can do, you can compare your code with this code that I have and see what is the thing that is missing. We have a label. Yes, we also have a label. We have an on-click event that is not here because nothing is happening when I click on this button. So they have not defined an on-click event, right? So that is fine. There is an also attribute called slot. Now, if I do not know what exactly this attribute is, you can go to the documentation section and go through this documentation in case if you want more details on how you need to use and what are the things that you need to look for when you're using this one. If you want to know the attributes and what exactly they would do, go to the specification section. In the specification section, I'm interested in understanding the slots, right? So if you see here, there is a slot attribute that I've used, right? Now, what I can understand from here, using the slots when set to value as action, placeholder for actionable components such as lightning button or lightning button menu, actions are displayed on the top right corner of the card after the title, right? In case if you want that kind of a styling, you can go ahead and copy it. I'll go ahead and quickly copy this one. Go to my VS Code HTML page and add that in here. You can add it anywhere. I'm just adding it here. And let's save this one and deploy the changes. So our changes are being deployed. And if I go back to my org, do a refresh. Ideally, this button that is there below should be going to the top right corner for that lightning card. Now, if you see here, earlier that button was here. Now it is on the right hand side. If I click on that button, everything is working as we have seen it earlier. So that is how you would do it. Now, one more interesting thing that we can do here is, in case if you want to make some changes to the preview that we have, what you can do, you can directly change it here itself. Test title. I'm just making changes here. As soon as I do it, I can see the preview here itself. That is another advantage that you have when you're working with the component library. Right? See, as soon as I make a change here, the same thing has been updated. Right? So instead of we making a changes after copying this code in our LWC component, you can directly make the changes. If you are satisfied with it, you can copy it and paste it in your LWC component. Right? You can do the vice versa also. You can take it here and make changes there as well. So this reduces one step of deploying the changes and see if everything is working. You can just do a basic changes that you would need, copy that code and paste it in your LWC component for the next things that you need to satisfy as a part of your requirement. It is suggested to make changes in your LWC component so that way you have something that you can save the changes rather than doing everything on your browser itself. So that brings us to the end of this video, where we have looked at how we can add a button to our Lightning component. Upon clicking on a button, we have understood how to listen to that events of on-click. We have printed a console log. We have also seen how do we debug our LWC component. So we have used an inspect as an option, went into the console tab to see if our button has been working or not. Post that, what we have understood the concept of passing some information from our JS file back to the HTML. Now, if you see here, we have also looked at a concept called property. Property is again a fancy name or a terminology that we use in JavaScript. In case if you are familiar with Epic's language, think that as a variable to hold your value. Now, how am I passing this value back to the UI? Simply using that property or the variable in Epic's language and enclosing them in curly braces. So this is how you would be passing your information from your JS file back to the HTML. In the next section, we'll see how do we take an input from the end user. If you look at this component, the only action that the user can do is to click on this button. Nothing else. Does this component is serving anything to the customer, anything to the user? The answer is no. We'll just take this component to the next level, where you would be taking an input from the user, where we'll be asking them to enter their name. And once they enter their name, we'll just greet them using hello, that username. So that is what we'll be doing in the next section. In case if you want to go ahead and give it a try, feel free to do it. In case if you have any concerns, follow the next section, where we will be going through that step by step.
Hey guys, if you like this video, do like, share and subscribe to SFDC Quest.